Hello everybody, we are going to work on chapter 21 today. Please turn in your books to chapter 21, which is my page 217. When I first arrived, I was expecting Indians, maybe not like those in dime novels or in James Fenimore Cooper's stories about Mohicans, but real Indians, different way, people way different from the kids I'd gone to school with. I never envisioned what I did find here at Tulagi. Full-bloods, Indian-looking boys and girls with black hair and brown skin make up only about 4 of every 10 students, which we kind of know because Cal is white, but on the other hand, it makes me wonder because you'd think Indian school would have more students that were more Indian, I guess. The next big groups are mixed bloods, kids with only one Indian parent who tend to be lighter skinned, lighter haired. They are real sensitive whenever a full-blood says they're not real Indians. Then there were the white kids. All of them have some Indian ancestry or claim to. All of them live on tribal rolls of the Indian nation, one Indian nation or another. Most of them are from historic communities that were reservations before allotment and the Oklahoma land rushes. A bunch of them look real white, blonde-haired and blue-eyed. They're the ones who get calls to Hitkey, white boy, by some of us Creeks. I never know how to say these, but I do know that it has a comma after there, and then white boys, that tells me that that's what that means. Us Creeks, I just said that, didn't I? Some of those white-looking Indians grew up thinking of themselves as Indians, maybe even speaking some of the language. Me? I grew up just thinking myself as a person. Being white means you have the luxury to do that. It means not worrying about who you are. You know your identity, even if you're a hobo. So there's that identity again. He's trying to figure out who he is. It also means outside of Indian school, not being told you don't belong if you have light skin, blonde hair, and blue eyes, like what happens almost every day with Tommy Wilson. White-looking, he calls himself Creek. He grew up in historic Creek land. His father, like Pop, is full-blood and went to Tulagi, and then he married a Norwegian lady. Tommy's another character, so I put his name out here and put a C next to it. Tommy sits next to me in Mrs. Teague's class. Tommy's a good kid. My first Monday at Tulagi, he greeted me in the hallway. "Welcome to Indian hell," he said. "So you're Muskogee, then?" I nodded. "Tommy," he said, patting his chest. "Muskogee Creek, like you." Like me, I thought. Yeah, right. I nodded again. Teacher here is old, but she's a good egg. Well, we know that's an idiom because she's not really a good egg, but it means she might be a nice lady. "Uh-huh," I said as I walked through the door. "You got your English book?" I shook my head. He opened to a page with the corner bent down. "This old poem," he said. "When we had to read it today we had to talk about it." I looked at the page and smiled. I already knew that poem. "Thanks," I said, and we took our seats. "Oh, east is east, and west is west, and never the twain shall meet." I remember that. Remember, we talked about that together. Mrs. Teague read. I looked over the top of her thick glasses at the class. "Who can tell me what that means?" No answer. "Does it mean that those from other lands can never get together, never understand one another?" She was met by silence. No one was raising a hand. Way different from my old white schools where those who knew an answer would be just about dislocating their arms, waving to get the teacher's attention. Well, that's hyperbole, because we know they're not actually doing that. Mrs. Teague's gaze settled on Tommy. "Mr. Wilson," she said, "stand up." Tommy stood, an uncomfortable look on his face. "Yes or no?" Tommy looked over at me. I'm not sure why. I lifted one finger from the side desk and then dropped it. He looked back at the teacher. "Yes," he said, his voice barely audible. Miss Teague smiled. "Good. Now why?" The uncomfortable silence that followed was even longer. Tommy wrapped his hands together and squeezed so hard that his knuckle popped. I raised my hand. Mrs. Teague looked at me. "New student," she said, pointing a short finger at my chest. "Can you tell us why? Stand." I stood as Tommy sat, letting out a sigh, and he sank back down into his chair. "The next lines," I said. "Really?" Mrs. Teague said, a skeptical smile on her face. Well, we know skeptical means that she doesn't really believe him. "Yes, ma'am. Are you certain?" I nodded, and then I did something I could never do on my own voice, me being reticent to say more than a few words at a time. And I circled that word reticent because I'm not sure what it means. But I do know that he doesn't really like to talk, so I think he's not very willing to say more than a few words. I recited Kipling's next lines of the Ballad of East and West from memory. till earth and sky stand presently at God's great judgment seat. But there is neither east nor west, border nor breed nor birth, when two strong men stand face to face, though they come from the ends of the earth. That is a very interesting poem, and that we know it because we read it together. That earned me some funny looks from the other students, along with a very big smile and a well done from Mrs. Teague, right after the bugle sounded to mark the end of the hour. "Muto," Tommy said to me under his breath as we left the classroom side by side, and he quickly peeled off as I turned up to join the Possum and Bear Meat outside the academic building. "You like 'em, white boy?" Bear Meat growled, pretending he only spoke broken English, like Mr. Parker, the old Cherokee man whose boys advisor in building 2. "Huh?" Bear Meat said. "You like 'em, that white boy?" He punched me in the shoulder. Playful, but he was still like getting kicked by a mule, and I remember that because, well, we first of all know that's a simile, but Bear Meat is a big guy. It's a big thing here, I knew now. Being labeled as a white student here at Tulagi was almost as bad as being seen as an Indian in the white world. Maybe you were not in danger of being driven off your land or even shot, but you still might be made to feel like an outsider a lot of the time. I'd come to realize just how lucky I was not to be seen that way. But it still didn't mean that I felt good about seeing people treated bad just for being who they were. "He's okay," I said, rubbing my shoulder and trying to restore some feeling in it. "Stahipki," said Grasshopper as he and Little Coons joined us. Grasshopper is the narrow-faced boy in Bear Meat's gang who is always chewing on something, grass, tree rosin, wriggly spearmint gum, paper, and spitting it out like an insect. As if to live up to his nickname, Grasshopper ejected from his mouth a piece of the eraser he'd just chewed off his pencil. "White boys no belong here. At least it's better than being called a Stalusti," Bear Meat chuckled. "Isn't it, Little Coon? I don't know what this is. I'm hoping we'll find out soon." Little Coon, whose name on the school records is Louis Oliver, pretended not to have heard him. Of all the boys in what I suppose I can now call our gang, me being included now, Louis seems the most thoughtful and the most sensitive. He's also the one likely, too, to do something diverting or funny whenever things get too serious. "Oh my," Little Coon said, turning to direct our attention east. "Take a look at those old turkey buzzards are doing, just circling over the old lockup like they think it was something was dead." "Maybe," Possum said, rubbing the scar on his cheek with his one finger, a gesture he seemed to make without knowing he was doing it. "Old H.D. is over there with those buzzards, being close relatives of his, are swooping in for a family reunion." We all laugh, but it's not that funny. That head disciplinarian, remember that's what H.D. stands for, is no laughing matter. I felt his gaze settle on me a time or two during the short period I've been here. I bet he wishes the new rules brought in by Superintendent Morrell weren't in effect. A horsewhipping and the like are forbidden now. I know that for a fact, because just yesterday H.D. grabbed Grasshopper, who was chewing gum, out of the line at morning roll call. "You," he roared, lifting Grasshopper up by his collar with his left hand as if he weighed no more than a puppy. There's as if, so that's a simile. The man's big face was red as a beet. He raised up his big, flat right hand. The big ring that H.D. wears on his right hand glinted as it caught in the light of the rising sun. That ring slipped around on his finger so that it was inside his palm. Slap a man's face with a ring, turn that way, and it'll leave a gash. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw the look on Possum's face. Now, remember, he has that big gash on his face. And I knew right then who my friend's scar came from. Possum looked ready to step in. If he had, I would have been right beside him. "Mr. Boehner?" It was Superintendent Morrell. His calm voice made the H.D. stop, close his palm, hiding the sharp ring edge. He lowered Grasshopper back to the ground and turned toward his boss. "Yes, sir," he said. "I caught this one chewing gum." Superintendent Morrell nodded. "You cannot have that," he said. "Rules are rules." He looked at Grasshopper, who was standing head down between the two of them. "Spit it out in your hand." Grasshopper did just that. "Now stick it onto your nose and leave it there for the rest of the morning." It was clear from the look on the H.D.'s face that he was not happy about being stopped, but he went along with it. While Grasshopper spent the rest of the morning standing at attention, the gum stuck on his nose and a sign reading, "Gum chewing is a filthy habit," hung around his neck. The only good thing about it, he said later, was that it was more interesting than Mr. Pond's class that he got to miss. That's very humiliating to do that sort of thing. Mr. Pond is the math teacher here at Tulagi. He's a big, horse-faced man. In the classroom where he's supposed to be teaching, he hardly looks at any of us. Instead, at the start of each class, he writes a bunch of problems on the board. "Do these," he says with a deep, sarcastic voice, though I doubt any of you dummies can. Well, he doesn't sound like a very good math teacher. Then he sits down, takes a swig of the cough medicine that he keeps locked in the middle drawer of his desk, leans back in his chair, folds his hands over his chest, closes his eyes, and goes to sleep until just before the bell rings. That's when Mr. Pond wakes up, sort of gradual, stands, stretches, and points to his desk. "You idiots, put your papers there. Now, get out of here." So Mr. Pond is the math teacher. I think I like him very well. I hate seeing others treated that way, even more than I hate being treated like a moron myself. It's just not right. So again, Cal is very empathetic. I think back to what it was like when I was on the road with Pop. There was none of that back then. Pop would not allow it, and more often than not, it was the true majority of men who were hobos, true knights of the road, thinking he makes me ache to be on the road again. Like that makes me ache to be on the road again, living that free life, feeling the wind in my face as I leaned out of the boxcar while Pop was fixing up grub behind me. What a life that was! Even though Pop's aim was to have us farm of our own again, I hate to admit I hardly ever thought about being back on our farm after our first month riding the rails together. So it sounds like he really kind of liked the rails even better than the farm. If it wasn't for my promise to Pop, I'd be having some serious thoughts right now about heading for the hills. Well, we know that he might want to leave. Or, to be more accurate, the rail yard. There's one in the nearest town where we got off the horses, the one Pop and I walked from. Unlike other kids who've run away in the past, no one would be able to predict where I was headed. I'd be on the first fast freight, 100 miles gone before they even knew I was missing. According to Possum, more Indian kids have run away from Tulagi than have ever actually graduated. That is an interesting statistic. The ratio may be a bit skewed, seeing how there are a bunch of kids like Pop who ran away again and again. Back about 4 years ago, Pop... Oh my gosh, I'm sorry about that. That was my mom. According to Possum, more Indian kids have run away from Tulagi than have ever actually graduated. The ratio may be a bit skewed, seeing how there were a bunch of kids like Pop who ran away again and again. Back about 4 years ago, Possum said they tried to punish the kids who run away more than once by expelling them. Think of that, punishing someone by telling them they can't come back to the place that they were trying to escape in the first place? That seemed weird. Possum chuckled. Like old Rabbit said, "Please don't throw me into that briar patch, Mr. Bear." That expulsion policy ended when CB and a group of school staff, all former students themselves, asked for a meeting with the old superintendent. "Giving a boy what he wants isn't what we call punishment," they pointed out. "Why, I never thought of it that way," was his response. The expulsion policy for runaways was abolished the next day. To be fair, there are some here, more than you'd think, who actually chose to come to an Indian school. Bad as a lot of the so-called education is here, Tulagi, like Pop said, is first rate when it comes to teaching farming. There it is again. You keep seeing that. Some Indian students who've gone here, I'm told, are managing to do a lot better at farming than stock rearing using the modern methods they learned here. There are other reasons why some Indian families, especially those who are Tulagi students themselves, have sent their children here. They've done it to give them a sense of belonging. Skinny's one of them. He's never tried to run away. "Where would I run to?" he said. "Back where my family lived, we were the only Indians for miles around. The one school I went to was only one. I was the only one with a brown face. I had to put up with other kids war-whooping when they saw me, calling me Sitting Bull, asking me where my teepee was. Round here, nobody treats me like I'm a wild Indian or a freak. Plus, I got football here. Little town where my family lives don't have enough kids to form a team. Being accepted as an Indian, that's what a lot of kids here feel good about." Oh, that's really interesting. And that's what some wish they could be. Those mentioned earlier, Stahitskis and Staluskis. White kids and black kids. All right, so that's our answer for Staluskis. Is black kids, especially the Staluskis. Too dark to pass for white, they might do better in this world by passing as Indian. Phonies. Try to get a free room and board and an education all paid for by the government. That's how Bear Meat sees the darkest skinned students here. Others, like Little Coon and Possum, were nowhere so judgmental. Being my pop's son, I fall on their side on this issue. As far as I'm concerned, it's what a man does and not how he looks that